There's a stretch of western Kentucky where the Green River runs slow and brown toward the Ohio. It's what's known as bottomland country. It's flat, wet and close. There are cornfields that stand higher than a man by late summer, tree lines that hold the last of the light, and old houses set back from the road far enough that a scream wouldn't carry to a neighbour. This is Henderson County. Spottsville sits near the water, and as a place it was already shrinking in 1975. It was a coal town where the coal was mostly gone. It had the kind of quiet that isn't quite peaceful. And here's the thing about this particular corner of the river. The people who'd lived here longest would tell you it already had a reputation. There were stories going back to the 1890s. Something in the fields, something the children a generation earlier had called simply the brown man. None of it was written down anywhere that mattered. It was just known. So when a family with 6 kids moved into a farmhouse on Mound Ridge Road that spring, they weren't arriving at an empty place. They were arriving at a place that already had a story. They just hadn't been told it. But let's spend a moment setting the scene properly because it matters. The family were the Nunnellys. The father, everyone called him Red, was a tough, no-nonsense sort of man. He certainly wasn't easily frightened. He was also, unfortunately, going blind. Glaucoma steadily taking his eyesight, which is a detail worth holding on to. Then there was his wife Rose, 6 children, the youngest just kids, and the older boys around 9 and 10. And there was also an adult son, Harold, who'd move a trailer onto the property partway through the year. They were poor, but generally happy. They were country people who'd tried city life, hadn't taken to it, and come back to the land to raise tobacco and a garden to let the children run. This is 1975. Rural, isolated, and largely self-reliant. If something went wrong out here, you dealt with it yourself. The nearest help was a phone call and a long wait away, assuming anyone believed you enough to come. And that independence is going to shape everything about what follows. Because when the Nunley started having trouble, the instinct wasn't to leave. It was to load a shotgun and hold the line. There's one more thing about this house. The previous renter had left in a real hurry. And before the Nunnellys moved in, he told them something. Reluctantly, almost embarrassed. He told them that one night he'd fired several rifle shots through the back screen door. And he'd fired at a large, hairy creature, something that was standing just outside and looking in. Red heard that story and he moved his family in anyway, like you might if you dismissed a ghost story. But he figured a 12 gauge would settle any argument the world really cared to start. We'll see how that held up. Of course, as with all these things, it started small, the way these things tend to. Chickens began disappearing, and at first that's nothing. Weasels, foxes, the ordinary tax the countryside charges on a henhouse. Then the older boys out in the fields hunting arrowheads started finding the dogs. And this is where I want to be careful because this is the part that's genuinely unpleasant and I'm going to describe it once and then move on. But this was the modus operandi of the animal because the animals weren't just killed. They were opened up from the groin to the throat and often emptied. The internal organs gone and the eyes and tongues taken. And around the bodies there was no blood, no tracks. Even in soft cultivated grounds where tracks should have been obvious. Stranger still, nothing would scavenge the remains, not even flies would land on them. Now, I'll come back to what we do and don't know about all that later. For now, let's just sit with what it would be like to be a 10-year-old finding that in your own field, in your own garden as such. Over the following months, the losses begin to mount up. And here we hit our first real question of evidence, which I'm going to flag plainly. In the contemporary reporting, the newspaper accounts from the time, the figure of loss is modest. It's around 16 chickens and a goat. In the fuller version Bart Nunnelly has told in later years, the tally grows considerably. To over 200 chickens, dogs, a pig, a goat, and even a horse. Both numbers come from the same family. And I'm not raising this to catch anyone out. I'm raising it because it's exactly how these stories tend to behave over the course of 50 years. The contemporary record is smaller and plainer. It might even be a bit diminished. The remembered version is larger and darker and might be exaggerated. Neither is necessarily a lie. But when you're weighing a case like this, you want to know which layer you're standing on. And then, after these incidents, came sightings. The first was Red's wife, Rose. Around 8 in the evening one day, she stepped onto the family porch to call the family in. To her left, by a shed, she noticed in the dark a shape, something tall, the suggestion that it was hairy. She'd later say it was at least 8 feet, maybe more, and it was watching her. She screamed, ran inside, and bolted the door. Red grabbed his shotgun, Harold grabbed his rifle, and Rose called the police. They came, they looked, and neither party found anything. And that became the pattern. The creature, or creatures, because more than one was sometimes reported, it became an almost nightly presence. In one instance, it chased Red out of a tobacco field. 10-year-old Dean saw it up close by an old truck. He, in particular, described a square jaw and small close-set eyes and hair that was reddish grey and patchy, thin in places, as if the animal were very old. One morning, all of the children saw it at once. It was standing in the corn out front of the house, and it was taller than the full-grown stalks, swaying slightly. So that's over 6.5 feet. And the police kept coming until they didn't, because once the calls became monster calls, the state police stopped responding. But the annoying thing is that word got around on the police band radio, though, and that's how the television news found the story. A camera crew came out, and so did a police sketch artist, and he drew a hairy man-like thing. Then the newspaper, the Gleaner out of Henderson, it ran a morning edition that gave the creature its now famous name, the Spottsville Monster. The article was actually fairly straight. It did get a few things wrong. It described the creature as green, it muddled the name of the road, and a few other little things. But by pure accident, that may have been the family's salvation. Because the errors sent the crowds of gun-toting monster hunters that descended on Spottsville to all the wrong places. And there were crowds. And that's the part people forget about these flaps from the 60s and 70s. For a while, this quiet stretch of river filled up with men and rifles and beer, all out looking for a monster to shoot. Unfortunately, the only one confirmed casualty of all that firepower, incidentally, was a dog. It was somebody's pet, shot by teenagers who had scared themselves silly. Meanwhile, the family were trying to defend an isolated farmhouse against something they couldn't identify and couldn't predict. And this is where the siege reaches its peak. One night, family and friends took up positions on the roof of the house, shotguns ready and dogs held below ready to go. And they heard the creature or creatures out in the dark. They released the dogs and fired at the sounds. The result is nothing. No body, No blood trail, no result. Just the noise and then the quiet slowly coming back. That rooftop standoff, for what it's worth, is the image the television shows would later build the whole story around, and we'll get to that. And then there's the neighbour. A man who lived less than half a mile up the road. A firefighter, a hunter, and a tracker. He'd been the one early on to come and warn the family that he'd flushed something big and hairy out of the woods near their property. As it happened, he and Red became close friends, and as we've established, he was an upstanding member of the community. As Red's eyesight failed, this neighbour took it upon himself to try and end the thing, to track it and kill it, for the sake of the children. And he got close more than once. By his account, he even fired on it. This was at the site of an abandoned house where the creature was stooping to look out of a window at him. And it's in this instance, the moment he fired, that he says it vanished. He also found trace evidence. Hair, a claw, a partial plaster cast of a 4-toed footprint pressed into near frozen ground. But this is where I have to be honest with you about the shape of the record, because up to this point we've been on reasonably solid ground. There have been multiple witnesses, contemporary press accounts, a sketch artist, and physical fear that has been truly documented. But the neighbour's fully story doesn't come to us from 1975. It comes from a single interview Bart Nunnelly conducted with him 30 years later in 2005. And I think we can agree it goes to a very different place. So let's look at it in some detail. Let's separate what we can stand on from what we can't, because the honesty of a case like this lives entirely in those kind of separations. Tier 1 is the family's ordeal itself. That an isolated farming family in Henderson County were terrified for the better part of a year in 1975 is about as well established as anything in this field ever gets. As I said, it's in the contemporary papers. It's also in the memories of multiple family members who were children at the time and who've told a consistent story on the record for decades. And it's confirmed by the single most powerful piece of evidence in the whole case, which isn't a footprint or a photograph in this instance. It's this macabre detail. For weeks, Red kept a 5-gallon bucket of kerosene by the kitchen door. His stated plan was that if the creature ever got into the house and he couldn't drive it off with the fire of bullets, it was to tip the bucket, light it, and burn the house down, even if that meant with his whole family inside. Because in his mind, dying together was better than the alternative he'd imagined for his children. It's a very dark place to go to, isn't it? And this is the detail that stops me every time, because the children had agreed to it. Now, you don't have to believe in a single monster to understand what that tells you, if it's true. Whatever was or wasn't out in those fields, the fear inside that house was total and it was real. I'd like to think that people don't rehearse the end of their own family because of a raccoon, or at least you hope they don't. So tier 1, something happened. The terror was genuine. And then there's tier 2. And if you'll forgive me, tier 2 is a different animal entirely. This is the neighbour's 2005 account. That the creature spoke to him, not aloud, but directly into his mind, telling him, and I'll quote this one line because the exact words matter to the account, "Don't be afraid, I will not harm you." But he went on to say that it stepped in and out of a shimmering doorway in the air, like heat rising off a summer road. That there were several of them using this doorway. That no bullet of any calibre could touch them. and that afterwards men who he took to be federal officials came to his home, confiscated his evidence and threatened to imprison him on invented charges, and forced him to sign a statement saying he'd only ever seen a large black bear. He said they later returned his plaster cast, smashed to powder in a freezer bag. Which is just mean, isn't it? Now, how do we handle that? Not with mockery. That's the lazy move, and it's not what I ever want this sort of channel to be about. Because the man Bart describes was, by his account, sincere, devout, and with nothing to really gain, and certainly no wish for publicity. There's no reason to think he set out to deceive anyone. But I'd point out a few things plainly. This is a single source, and it's uncorroborated. It was recalled 30 years after the events. And it was recalled by a man who himself had been clinically dead for a period after a heart attack in 1985, who tied his own long silence to that event. We should also state that memory is not a recording. 30 years is a very long time. And the most extraordinary claims in this entire case, the telepathy, the disappearing, the government men, all arrive through this one late channel, and none of the more ordinary, checkable ones. So when I weigh it, I have to say Tier 1 and Tier 2 are not the same evidence, and they shouldn't be spent as if they were the same currency. I'm not even sure they're really the same stories. And that brings us to the actual question. If we stay in Tier 1, a large, hair-covered upright thing terrorising a farm, what are the honest possibilities? The first, always, is misidentification of a known animal. And this is where I get to do the thing I enjoy, which is check the story against the map, so to speak. The official explanation, the one the neighbour said was forced on him, was that of a black bear. But there's a problem with that, because black bears were effectively wiped out of Kentucky by around 1900 at latest, through overhunting, logging, you name it. And they didn't begin returning until the 1980s, and when they did, it was into the southeast of the state, the Appalachian side, through natural dispersal and later reintroductions. Henderson County, where Spottsville is in the far west. So in 1975, a wild black bear there would have been a genuine sensation in its own right. So the tidy, sceptical, move along explanation is, ironically, describing an animal that almost certainly wasn't in that landscape either. The bear doesn't save you here if you're trying to be logical. And that's a pattern I find genuinely interesting. The debunks being nearly as strange as the claim, which happens a lot in these cases. The second possibility is a straightforward Bigfoot type report. And on the surface, Tier 1 fits the North American wild man template reasonably well. The creature is tall, bipedal, hair-covered, drawn to livestock, it's active near water and cover, and it's more aggressive around the home than the shy forest giant of the Pacific Northwest. And that aggressive home-invading behaviour actually lines up better with the Ohio and Appalachian wild man accounts than with the classic sort of elusive Sasquatch, which is a distinction that tends to get flattened out sometimes. The third possibility is folklore and social contagion. Remember, this river already had its stories, those 1890s reports of the brown man. It's a frightened, isolated family and a landscape primed with legend. A newspaper that hands the fear a name. And then hundreds of armed strangers turned up to hunt it, each of them ready to see something. Fear is contagious and it's productive. It doesn't just distort what people see, it generates new sightings. And people can feel that pressure to perform. And of course, we might not ever be able to resolve it. That the physical evidence, the cast, the hair, the claw, went wherever it went and can't be examined now. that the record we have is a mix of genuinely frightened family, a real contemporary press flap, and a much later, much stranger overlay from a single source. And that no amount of wanting an answer really conjures one. That's the analyst, that's where the evidence, unfortunately, leaves us. But I do want to widen the frame for a moment, because Spottsville is a near perfect case study in something bigger. It's a story we can actually watch grow. In 1975, it's a local newspaper item, 16 chickens, a goat, a scared family, and a sketch. By 2005, it's telepathy and dimensional doorways and a federal cover-up. By 2010, it's an episode of Monster Quest. And by 2015, it's on Monsters and Mysteries in America, where the network sells it as an entire family taking up arms in a rooftop showdown against a beast with a taste for human flesh. By 2019, it's a documentary short that you can stream. Each retelling keeps the rooftop because the rooftop is cinematic and sands down the parts that don't perform. Each one adds a little heat, adds a little more conjecture. And this is how a modern legend is actually built. Not by one big lie, but by decades of sincere retelling, with each layer laid gently on the last, until the plain frightened family at the bottom is almost invisible beneath everything that's been added on top. And I think that's worth naming, because it really does cut both ways. The accretion is a reason for caution. Most of the wildest material is late and thin and untestable. But the accretion isn't the origin. Something at the bottom of all this sent real people up onto their own roof with shotguns and put a bucket of kerosene by a kitchen door. You can strip away every television framing and every embellished retelling, and that hard little core is still sitting there. And it's unexplained. So, what was the Spottsville Monster? In truth, I can't tell you, but neither can anyone else, honestly. If there was physical evidence, it's gone, and the most spectacular testimony is single source and comes to us decades later. And the plainest explanation, a bear, doesn't even fit the map. What I can tell you is what's left when the noise dies down. A family who came home to the country looking for something simpler, easier. A family who spent 11 months frightened in their own house, who rehearsed dying together rather than losing one of their children to whatever they believed was out there in the corn, and who, in January of 1976, packed up and left and never really went back. You can photograph a footprint, but you can't photograph that fear, that sense of escalation and desperation. And it's a part of this story that no cover-up, no television edit, and no 50 years of retelling has ever managed to explain away. It's the heart and core of the story, because in the end, the monster is the part we argue about. The fear is the part that was clearly real. Thanks as always for watching. If this one got under your skin, a like genuinely helps the channel, and if you're not already subscribed, that's where you'll catch the next one. And if you like this blend of sort of real cases, unknown animals, and the folklore that grows around them, it's the same territory I write about in my own books. And you can find them on Amazon and Audible if you fancy going a little deeper, certainly into the fictional side. But for now, thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. See you next time, and bye for now.